The first time he looked under my hood, I knew he saw more than just the car. My name is Rachel Delaney. I'm 48, and I live in a quiet suburb just outside Charleston. I married Mark when I was 26. He was my first real love, the kind of love you don't question, because it shows up with a ring, a steady job, and a plan. We bought a 3-bedroom ranch, had our daughter, and spent the next 20 years building a life that looked great in photos. Only it didn't feel great. Not to me. Mark's the kind of man who prides himself on being dependable. He fixes the garbage disposal when it breaks, mows the lawn every Saturday like clockwork, and never forgets to put gas in my car. He loves with logistics. He shows care through calendars, through checklists, through things that look like effort but don't feel like intimacy. You know? Some days, I sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold, and I try to remember the last time he touched me just because he wanted to. Not out of obligation. Not because it was a special occasion. Just because he missed me. I still fold his laundry. Still make dinner. Still smile when his coworkers come over and say, "Mark's lucky to have you." I wonder what they'd say if they knew how often I fall asleep with my back turned to him, eyes wide open in the dark. Our daughter just started her 2nd year of college. And with the house this quiet now, I'm forced to hear things I used to drown out. The silence between Mark and me. The way he clears his throat before saying something mildly affectionate. The sound of me wondering if this is all there is. And then, the truck broke down. It was Mark's Ford F-150, and it had been making a clicking sound in the front wheel well for weeks. I finally took it in when it started pulling to one side on the highway. Mark told me to go to Joey's garage. "Ask for Dean," he said. "He's the only one I trust with that engine." Joey's garage is tucked behind a shuttered gas station on Old Broad Street, just past the overgrown lot where they used to hold farmers' markets. It's not one of those polished, modern shops. It's a real garage, concrete floors, rusted license plates on the wall, the faint smell of grease and burnt coffee. I pulled up mid-morning. Dean was under the hood of a classic Camaro, arms covered in grease, faded tattoos peeking out from under the sleeves of his thermal shirt. He didn't hear me at first. Or maybe he did and waited to finish what he was doing. Either way, when he stood up and turned around, I felt a small jolt in my chest. He was older than I expected, maybe mid to late 40s. His beard was short but scruffy, his eyes sharp and a kind of pale green that made me feel like he could see things I hadn't said yet. "You must be Rachel," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Mark's wife." I nodded. "That's me." He gave a small smile, just enough to register. Then he looked over at the truck. "That your ride?" "Mostly. He drives the sedan these days." Dean gave a small nod and circled the truck slowly, like it was something alive. Then he looked back at me and said, "If you've been the one driving it, maybe you're the one who needs a full checkup." It was a joke. A line, probably. But something about the way he said it made my skin prickle under my blouse. I laughed, more nervous than amused. He smiled again, slower this time, and then he turned his focus to the truck. That first visit should have been in and out. But I stayed, watched as he worked. He explained things I didn't understand, but made them sound like poetry. He didn't talk down to me. He didn't rush. At one point, he asked if I wanted a drink from the old Coke machine out front. I said sure. When he handed it to me, our fingers brushed, and that tiny spark felt more real than anything I'd felt in years. The second time I came in, he said the truck needed new bearings. Said I could bring it back next week early if I wanted. Before the rush. "I'll be here." I told myself it was just easier that way. Less traffic. No wait. Nothing to read into. That morning, I put on a blouse I hadn't worn in a while. Soft pink. It brought out the color in my cheeks. I didn't think about it too much. But I did notice when his eyes lingered for a second longer than before. We talked more that day. He asked if I had any kids. I told him about Emily, how she wanted to study environmental science. How she was always smarter than I gave her credit for. He listened. Really listened. Like what I said mattered. Then he asked, "What about you? What do you do for you?" I blinked. I mean, besides taking care of everybody else. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even remember the last time I did something just for me. It became a pattern. I'd find some excuse to check on the truck. Or he'd text to say something small came up and I might want to swing by. I told myself it was about the vehicle, but it wasn't. One day, I mentioned I used to paint. Oils, mostly. Landscapes. Quiet things. He asked why I stopped. I said, life got in the way. He looked at me, real serious, and said, then maybe life needs to get out of your way. That night, I dreamed about him. Not touching me. Not even speaking. Just standing in my kitchen, watching me paint. Watching me be. The third visit, it poured. One of those heavy southern thunderstorms that makes the sky bruise dark at noon. I was supposed to drop off the truck and grab a ride home, but Dean waved me into the garage. No sense standing in that mess. Come in, I'll make coffee. The waiting room was warm. Smelled like oil and sawdust. He handed me a mug and stood in the doorway, watching the rain hit the pavement like bullets. You ever think about leaving? He asked softly. I swallowed. Leaving what? The routine. The schedule. The silence. I didn't answer, but I looked at him. I really looked, and he stepped forward. Not touching. Just close. Close enough that I could smell the rain on his skin, feel the heat radiating off his chest. He reached up and brushed something from my shoulder, probably just the rain. You deserve more than being invisible, Rachel. My breath caught. Then, the door behind us slammed open. Mark. Soaking wet. Eyes hard. Jaw clenched. Am I interrupting something? Mark didn't say a word on the drive home. The only sound was the squeak of the windshield wipers against the glass, fighting the storm outside, and the one sitting thick between us in the cab. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I sat perfectly still, like if I didn't move, I could pretend the whole thing hadn't happened. He hadn't seen anything happen. But that wasn't the point. Something was brewing beneath the surface, not a flash of jealousy, not even suspicion. It was the kind of quiet you hear just before something breaks. When we got home, he went straight to the basement under the guise of checking the sump pump, but I knew he just didn't want to look at me. I changed into dry clothes, put on a pot of tea I never drank, and stared at the hallway mirror for what felt like an hour. I kept touching my collarbone, as if the heat of Dean's presence had left something behind. Dean's voice was still in my head. You deserve more than being invisible, Rachel. The truth was, I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt exposed. The next morning, Mark acted like everything was fine. Too fine. He made coffee, toasted bread I hadn't asked for, and asked about my day like we were on a first date with cameras watching. He kissed my forehead and held it there a second too long. He didn't bring up Dean. Not once. Which somehow made it worse. For days, we performed. I cleaned. He mowed. We sat through dinner like actors in a play neither of us auditioned for. The silence between us grew teeth. But Dean hadn't vanished. He texted 2 days later. Dean, you okay? Dean, that wasn't how I wanted things to go. I stared at the screen for hours. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, deleting and retyping a dozen responses. Me, it's complicated. He didn't push. Just sent back, you don't owe anyone your silence. That hit me harder than I wanted it to. The thing about emotional infidelity, if that's even what this was, is that it lives in gray areas. Dean and I hadn't kissed. He'd never touched more than my arm, never said anything overt. But I felt more with him in those few garage visits than I had in my marriage in years. I started painting again. It had been at least a decade since I'd touched a brush. My hands shook the first time I dipped into the ochre and spread it across the canvas. I painted small things at first. Still lives. Emily's old sneakers. A pair on a windowsill. Then bolder things. A stormy sky. A woman's back turned to the sea. Mark noticed. Of course he did. He'd come in from work and stand in the doorway watching. Didn't know you still had it in you, he said once. I looked at him and smiled. Neither did I. He started coming home earlier. Asked about my day. He was trying. In his own awkward, almost endearing way, he was trying. But it was like watching someone use a map from 10 years ago to find a road that no longer existed. One afternoon, I was wiping down a brush when I got a message from Dean. Just a photo. The edge of the garage at sunrise. Pale gold light stretching over the cement. Underneath it, one line. Wish you could see this. I stared at it too long. My heart thudded. Not fast. Just heavy. Like something deep inside me had started knocking. Later that night, Mark walked into the room and caught me reading the message again. He didn't ask who it was from. He didn't need to. His face said everything. "Are you done with this yet?" he asked, not with anger, but exhaustion. Like he'd already lost something and wasn't sure what it was. I couldn't answer. I wasn't sure either. Days passed. Then weeks. I tried to bury it, but the ache stayed. I'd see Dean in small places. A man leaning against a truck at a red light, a certain laugh in a hardware store. Ghosts of something that hadn't even happened. One Sunday, I went to the grocery store, and as I was backing out, I saw his truck. Parked 2 rows down. He was sitting in the cab, head resting back on the seat. Eyes closed, like he hadn't slept. I didn't approach. I didn't wave. But he opened his eyes. And we looked at each other. Not a stare. Not a question. Just a moment. Then I drove away. That night, I wrote him a letter. I didn't send it. Just folded it and placed it between the pages of an old poetry book I kept in the linen closet. The book was falling apart. The spine cracked. It opened automatically to the section titled, "Things Fall Apart." We hadn't crossed a line. But we built one so thin, so strained, that one more glance might have broken it. The next weekend, Mark told me he was going on a guy's trip. Something about fishing, beer, and old friends. "You sure you don't mind?" he asked. I shrugged. "Go. Enjoy yourself." He packed too quickly, like someone already half gone. Saturday night, I was folding laundry when my daughter Emily called. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay?" "Yeah, why?" "I saw Dad on Aunt Carol's Instagram. He was at her house. I thought he was on a trip." I froze. Carol was Mark's sister. She lived 2 hours away. And she hated hosting. "Maybe plans changed," I said. "I'll ask him." When he came home the next day, he was calm. Too calm. His shirt was buttoned wrong. His watch was on the opposite wrist. He kissed my cheek like a man returning to a script he hadn't rehearsed. That night, he sat across from me and said, "We need to talk." He admitted he'd been talking to someone. A woman from work. Nothing physical, he insisted. Just long lunches, shared jokes, a shoulder. He said he didn't cross a line. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was painfully familiar. "Do you feel seen by her?" I asked. He looked startled. Then nodded slowly. "Then now you know." He went silent. We sat there in the kitchen, 2 strangers holding the wreckage of a life we'd both stopped building a long time ago. We didn't decide anything that night. No big fight. No slammed doors. Just the quiet acknowledgement that something inside us had shifted. The next morning, I walked out to the garage and saw the truck. My reflection in its windshield. The side mirror still had a faint smudge, Dean's handprint, maybe. Or just dirt. Hard to say. I didn't text him. But when I went to the store later that day, I found an envelope wedged under my windshield wiper. No name. Just a sketch of a woman, back turned, holding a paintbrush. Underneath, 3 words. "Still seen. Always." Mark left the ring on the dresser. I left everything else.